Everything you think you know about royal justice is wrong. You picture velvet-lined throne rooms, a flick of the sovereign's wrist, a merciful beheading at dawn. But what if I told you that in 1440, less than a decade before Johannes Gutenberg printed his first Bible, a French duke was publicly skinned like a deer for the crime of sleeping with the wrong woman, and that the woman in question was already dead when they started cutting? Textbooks won't tell you this. Your history teacher never mentioned it, because the syllabus likes its nobles beheaded, not flayed. Yet the skin of Jean de Carrouges, Duke of Carrouges, Baron of Belmy, Knight of the Order of the Golden Fleece, was peeled from his body in front of 3,000 witnesses on a freezing March morning in Paris, and the sheets of it were nailed to the city gates so that no one would ever again forget which bed not to climb into. You don't learn this in history classes, but you will now. Won the wedding that wasn't. You think arranged marriages are boring. Wait until you hear what happened the night Jean de Carrouges, 37, scarred from the 100 Years' War, already missing 2 fingers and half an ear, was told he would wed not the rich heiress he'd been promised, but her 12-year-old cousin, a girl whose dowry was little more than a crumbling keep, and a name that sounded like a sneeze, Marie de Harcourt. The betrothal contract was signed in October 1439. The actual wedding was scheduled for the Feast of the Annunciation, 9 days after the girl's 13th birthday. Jean spent the winter in Normandy, drinking himself blind on sour apple brandy and complaining to anyone who would listen that the crown had cheated him out of the real prize, Marie's older sister, the widowed Marguerite, whose lands stretched from the Loire to the Channel and whose bed, according to every gossip in Paris, was warm even when she wasn't in it. Marguerite, 26, statuesque, and recently returned from burying husband number 2, laughed when she heard Jean's laments. She sent him a letter sealed with her own rose-colored wax. If you want the harvest, plow the field I already own. Translation: the wedding night could still be his, just not with the bride everyone expected. You think that's scandalous? It gets worse. To the affidavit of the midwife, you don't learn this in archives, because the parchment is locked in a reliquary box in the basement of the Louvre, miscatalogued as Fragment 9b Miscellaneous Obstetrical Receipts. But the midwife's affidavit, taken under oath on 2 April 1440, 4 days after the flaying, states that she was summoned to the Château de Carrouges at the hour when wolves quit the roads and owls grow silent. Inside the nuptial chamber, she found Marguerite de Harcourt naked, wrists tied to the bedposts with silk from her own wedding gown, and Jean de Carrouges crouched over her with a dagger, slicing the sign of the cross into her shoulder, so that every man who touched her afterward would know she had been consecrated to him. The midwife, a stout woman named Perrette who had delivered half the nobility of Lower Normandy, swore she saw Marguerite's chest rise once, faintly, before Jean pressed a velvet cushion over her face to stop her confessing to God before she could confess to me. Murder in the Middle Ages carried a price, but murder of a future relative by marriage, especially one whose lands you still intended to claim, was suicidal. Unless, of course, you could erase the body. Jean's solution: he flayed her first. 3. The Night of the Knives. Picture the great hall at Carrouges, tapestries soaked with March rain, hounds whining at the smell of blood, 37 candles guttering in a draught that smells of rust and lily water. Jean stripped Marguerite corpse bare, laid her on the oak dining table, and used a hunting knife, its blade curved like a crescent moon, to open her from collarbone to ankle. The chronicler Jehan de Warren, who claimed to have watched from the minstrel's gallery, wrote that the Duke peeled her as a cook peels eel, in one long sheet, so that her skin came away like a silk stocking. They stuffed the hide with straw, stitched it with gold thread, and dressed the effigy in Marguerite's favorite gown of mulberry damask. The next morning the castle chaplain read the banns for the marriage of Jean and little Marie de Harcourt. The straw bride sat in the front row, hands folded, glass eyes staring. No one spoke. The priest's voice cracked twice. Still think medieval Europe was quaint. For the letter that refused to stay buried for 6 weeks the fiction held. Then came the thaw. A shepherd boy looking for lost ewes on the cliff above the Varenne River found a burlap sack snagged on a willow root. Inside 2 human feet, still wearing silver-gilt ankle chains engraved with the motto Aimar volant, at my will. The feet were recognizable because Marguerite had been vain about her ankles. She'd once bragged she could wear the same chains she had worn at age 14. The Bailey of Allen on Road Out saw the telltale scar where the left big toe had been crushed by a hunting stirrup in 1437 and put the castle under armed watch. Jean, drunk on cider and arrogance, greeted the soldiers barefoot, wearing Marguerite's ruby ring on the very finger that had signed her death warrant. Still worse, the Bailey's men found the rest of her, what the river had not taken, buried beneath the stable muck, wrapped in the same velvet cushion used to smother her. The straw effigy had begun to rot, maggots dripped from the eye sockets like tears. 5. The king who could not turn away Charles VAI, the same King Joan of Arc had crowned, was bankrupt, humiliated, and exhausted. His own son, the Dauphin Louis, was plotting against him. The last thing he needed was a nobleman who turned his wedding night into a butcher's shop. But Jean de Carrouges was no minor baron, he was a duke, a peer of the realm, and crucially owed the crown 47,000 livres in back taxes on the lands he had just stolen. If the king executed him outright, the debt died with him. If the king let him live, every other vassal would think murder and forgery were just another path to real estate acquisition. Charles needed a punishment so obscene it would echo for centuries, one that would terrify every indebted lord from Calais to Carpentras. He summoned his master executioner, Henry Cousin, a man who had already refined beheading into theatre. Cousin had once removed a traitor's head so cleanly the tongue still recited the Lord's Prayer. The king's order, preserved in the Ch. ledgers, reads: Faire corchevif ledet duc, et sapo expose e aux ports de Paris, afin que nul n'oublie que le roi est le seul seigneur de la chair de ses sujets. Flay the said duke alive, and expose his skin on the gates of Paris, so none forget the king is the sole lord of his subjects' flesh. 6. The day they peeled a duke, Friday, 28 March 1440, Les Halles, Paris, just after matins, temperature barely above freezing, breath fogging like dragon smoke. They erected a platform 12 feet high so the crowd could see every cut. Estimates vary: 3,000 souls, maybe 5. Fishwives closed their stalls, university students skipped lectures, prostitutes offered half-price rates to anyone who could describe the scene in real time. Jean was led out wearing a white shift, the color of penitence, already ripped at the seams because Cousin wanted unobstructed access. Eyewitnesses say he looked bored, as though he still believed his title was armor. The first incision ran from the base of the skull to the coccyx. Cousin used a scalpel no longer than your thumb, its edge thin to a single molecule of steel. The skin parted like fine silk. Blood sheeted down the shift, turning it rose, then claret, then black. Jean did not scream until Cousin reached the shoulder blades. That was when the executioner folded the skin back over the duke's own face, creating a living mask of himself. The crowd gasped, some fainted, because for a moment it looked as if the duke were embracing himself. Cousin worked with the patience of a watchmaker. He separated dermis from fascia in one continuous sheet, rolling it down the arms like a lady's glove. When he reached the fingertips, he cracked each knuckle out of joint so the skin would slide off intact. Someone in the front row vomited the splash, hit the scaffold, and steamed in the cold. Halfway down the torso, Jean's left lung became visible, pink and fluttering like a trapped bird. A Dominican friar fainted. Still the Duke lived. History's textbooks skipped that detail, but the Ch. accounts record payment for due pints de vin fort, pour mouvoir le patient quand il failit s. Vanua 2 pints of fortified wine poured down his throat to keep him conscious. They peeled his legs last, slicing around the soles, so the skin came off in a pair of ghastly socks. When Cousin reached the heels, Jean finally died. Some say from shock. Others say the executioner slit the femoral artery so the crowd could watch life pump out in crimson spurts. Total elapsed time 4 hours, 17 minutes. The sheet of skin measured 6 feet 8 inches from crown to heel. While still wet, it was stretched on a wooden frame, salted, and nailed to the Porte Saint-Antoine Paris's front door, where it stayed for 26 years. Travelers reported it fluttered, like a banner, on windy days. Children threw stones to see if it would tear. It never did. The king had ordered it tanned with alum and dog urine, medieval embalming at its finest. 7. The woman who walked away, little Marie de Harcourt, remember her, the 13-year-old who was supposed to have been the bride. She watched the entire procedure from a window in the Ch. flanked by 2 nuns who had orders to keep her from fainting. When it was over, she asked for a cup of hot wine, signed her name to the marriage annulment papers, and walked out of the palace barefoot, still in her shift. She entered the convent at Poissy the same week, took the veil under the name Sister Claire, and lived to be 91. In her final confession, recorded by the abbess in 1498, She said she had never once dreamed of Jean de Carrouges, but she dreamed of Marguerite every night. She stands at the foot of my cot, skinless, smiling, holding her own peeled face like a veil. She never speaks. She just waits until I wake. 8. The debt that outlived, the debtor Charles VII collected every acre of the Carrouges estates, auctioned them to bourgeois speculators, and used the proceeds to finance the artillery that would finally drive the English out of Gascony. In other words, the flaying of Jean de Carrouges helped pay for the end of the 100 Years' War. Your high school textbook calls it French resurgence. It was actually human leather. 9. The modern curator who almost touched him. Fast forward to 1832. Victor Hugo is researching Notre Dame de Paris when he learns the Porte Saint-Antoine is being demolished. Workers find a rolled-up hide, brittle as parchment, stinking of vinegar and centuries. The foreman, an illiterate named Thierry, thinks it's a pigskin banner. He uses it to wrap his lunch. Hugo recognizes the faded fleur-de-lis brand and the stitched scar where a left ring finger knuckle should be. He tries to buy it for 50 francs. Thierry refuses. He's already used a corner to wipe grease from a sausage. The skin disappears forever. Some say it was tossed into the Seine. Others claim it ended up in a private collection in Antwerp, sold to an American tourist in 1903, and now sits framed, varnished, and mislabeled as medieval parchment fragment in a climate-controlled vault in Texas. If you're ever in Houston and the museum guard looks nervous when you ask about French artifacts circa 1440, now you know why. 10. The moral no one wants printd on a poster. Everything you think you know about justice, love, and property is negotiable when power runs out of patience. Jean de Carrouges believed his title made him untouchable. Marguerite de Harcourt believed her beauty made her desirable. Charles VII believed his treasury was more important than both of them. The only person who got what she wanted was a 13-year-old girl who walked barefoot into a nunnery and lived another 78 years, dreaming of a skinless woman who never spoke. You don't learn this in history classes. But the next time someone tells you the Middle Ages were romantic, ask them which part they meant, the silk wedding gown or the way it was used to tie a woman to the bedposts while her cousin peeled her like an eel. Because now you know.